Good morning, welcome. We are just delighted that you've decided to spend the Sabbath before Christmas with us as we continue our lesson on the Gospel of John. We're going to talk about John's instrument for glorification in a second, but before we do that, we're going to invite you to join us as we pray. God, thank you so much for your blessings, just your compassion, the desire that you give us to be with you. We just would pray that as this season descends upon us, that you allow us to remember the baby that is glorified through a life of service and submission to the Father and a death of obedience on a cross. We thank you and we hope anxiously for the day when you shall return, for we pray in your name. Amen. So now I get to invite my co-host and my friend, Joey. Oh, Joey, how are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to the Christmas season. We're right in the middle of it. School's going to be getting out soon, and just being able to enjoy time with family. It's always something I look forward to during Christmas.
Isn't it great? Isn't it great? Do you guys have any Christmas holiday traditions that you enjoy doing?
Yeah, we have a few. We like to, from when the kids were young, we watched Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer together. That was something we always did. On Christmas morning, we always read through the story of Jesus in the book of Luke together. And then we are all in pajamas and open gifts and take our annual Christmas picture. We do gingerbread houses together. So those are a few of our
That sounds like
traditions.
a fun Christmas morning at the old house.
How about you?
Let's see. There's a big debate in our home. My wife believes firmly that Christmas presents are to be opened on Christmas Eve. I, on the other hand, believe that Christmas gifts are to be opened on Christmas morning, because that's how we both grew up. So it's fun because on Christmas Eve we get to go to my in-laws and celebrate with her family. On Christmas Day it's kind of more us, although this year I think my parents are flying in, and so we'll have them, and it'll be great. It's gonna be. We're looking forward to kind of some time separated from just the busyness of everyday life. So we're excited about that.
So then, do your kids get to open presents on both days?
They do.
That's nice.
They do. So they're actually, as most kids do, they are benefiting from any debate that occurs between their parents. Yeah. So they're playing one against another, and we recognize that we are being played like violins, but it's okay.
Yeah. In our family, we open one gift on Christmas Eve and then the rest on Christmas morning. But this year, we're going to be traveling, so we'll actually be celebrating Christmas on Monday, I believe, before we leave. And so we're going to open presents then, and then
very cool.
And then head.
And then you'll be out for a little while.
Yeah, for about a week.
Good. Yeah. This is gonna be good. It's a good time. We usually leave the day after Christmas. We take usually it's a ski trip, and my boys, I don't know if they enjoy them, but it's a tradition, and so that's what we'll be doing this year.
Yeah. That's exciting. I love how you framed this, the instrument of Jesus' glorification.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated to see what the instrument of Jesus' glorification is in this passage.
Well, it's pretty evident, right? The lesson deals with John chapter 18 and John chapter 19. And so that's where we will invite you now to turn. And John obviously has been leading us on tumultuous and rather tortuous trip towards Jerusalem. And we know that in Jerusalem, Jesus is going to face complete and utter rejection by everyone. The Roman system that is intended to provide some checks and balances to Jewish religious leaders will fail. The crowd that at some moments has remained adoring and others has rejected Jesus will ultimately leave him, and his disciples will also walk out on him.
Wow.
So it's the complete and utter abandonment of Jesus that we see coming into focus on in John chapter 18 and 19. And yet it seems like throughout all of that, there is this idea that through this act, through what happens in these two chapters, not only is Jesus glorified, but the character of the Father is revealed.
Wow. I love that. I love that. Yeah. Throughout the book of John, we've been getting glimpses of the glory of Jesus, but ultimately it's leading to this point. And I very much appreciated the writer of the lesson study, how he talked about how he pointed out how in the book of John it's sort of uneven. You get 3.5 years in 10 chapters, and then the last 11 to 21 you get like 2 weeks, and it's just really focusing. So all of John, like you had said, has been building to this climax of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. This is what the book of John has been pointing to. This is the ultimate revelation of Jesus' glory and the Father's glory. And it's powerful because that moment happens, like you said, when we've been talking about how all throughout this, the question has been, will you believe, right? Will you believe that Jesus is the Messiah? And it seems like at the moment of his glorification, at the moment when he is most clearly revealed on the cross, his love for us is revealed, almost everybody rejects him and walks away and says, no, we will not believe. Peter denies him, right? One of his closest disciples denies him. The religious leaders, the crowd, like everybody that Jesus, the question has always been, will they believe, will they not believe? And at this point, at the cross, at his ultimate glorification, they all seem to fail.
Right.
And yet the story's not over.
That's the beauty of it, that what appears as a story that ends in defeat is actually a story that ends in a reframing of what some terms mean. So we talked a little bit about what it means for Jesus to be glorified, and the glorification of the Son and the revelation of the Father are all broken into this new paradigm because of the submission and the obedience of the Son. And so you have kind of this breaking in of what it means to understand these terms in a different way. It starts, though, by a subtle reframing that the lesson talks about, and that John is very intentional in laying out before us, and that is, what does it mean to abide by and to have knowledge of the truth? And that ultimately is the question that I think most people will ask. Do you believe because this is true? And that is the question that is at the crux of the debate that Jesus will have with Pilate. What is truth?
What is truth? Yeah, and it's not really the debate that Pilate wants to have, right? Which is the interesting thing. As I was reading the passage, it kind of struck me that Pilate has an agenda. He just wants simple answers. He wants this problem off his plate, and nobody will give him a straight answer. He asks the religious leaders, like, why did you bring him before me? And like, what crime is he accused of? And they don't give him the answer. They just say, basically they say, trust us, right? Like, why would we have brought him before you if he wasn't guilty, right? They don't say what it is. And then when he asks Jesus takes him on a different track. He says, you say that I'm a king. I came here to show you truth. Right. And so it's like Pilate is frustrated, and yet Jesus is it's almost like Jesus is being evangelistic to Pilate here. That's the sense I get. I don't know. What do you get here?
Well, what's interesting is Jesus says, I have come to witness for the truth. And Pilate is unable or unwilling to actually recognize what Jesus is trying to say. So he says, okay, well, what is truth? I guess if you want to force me to have this conversation, which I don't want to have, let me ask you the question, what is truth? And Jesus never explicitly answers that question. What you have right after that is simply Jesus kind of falling silent for the majority of chapter 18 and then the first half of chapter 19. Jesus is saying nothing until Jesus is having to engage Pilate again, where he is asking, so where do you come from? And Jesus simply says, you have no power over me. So there's these questions about the mission, right? Truth and the origin of Jesus that for Pilate remain unanswered because John has spent 18 chapters answering them already. And this, I think, at this point, what is being recorded by John is not for Pilate's benefit, it's for our benefit.
Yeah.
If you can answer these questions after 18 chapters, then we have a problem.
Wow. So it's almost like Jesus is saying, is my ministry, my life speaks for itself. What you've already learned throughout the book of John speaks for itself. At this point, if you haven't made that decision, it's like, what more can I say?
Yeah. I mean, the question, where do you come from? How much ink has John spent saying that Jesus comes from above? That Jesus comes to witness to the Father, that his sheep know his voice, that he was in the beginning. What is truth? How much time has John spent reminding us that the Son came into the world to save the world, not to condemn the world? How much time has the Son spent telling us that he has come that we might have life and life abundant? How much has been spent for 18 chapters with this Jesus character that continues to say, I have come to show you the way? So by this point, I think the issue has to be settled. And now it does turn evangelistic, Joey. I think you're right. The passage does turn evangelistic. But maybe not as much for Pilate as it is for the reader. Because now you're being invited to consider the ramifications of living a life that is centered towards the truth and living a life that is designed to testify to what is true and to follow Jesus as a child of the light or a child from above, as John has shared with us throughout this book.
Yeah, that's a good point. That retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, I find no basis for a charge against him, right? So he says, what is truth? Doesn't wait for the answer. He just immediately goes out and says, I have no reason to crucify him. And if one of the truths are that Jesus is not guilty, it seems like it's very clear to Pilate, there's no reason to crucify him, and yet he ends up crucifying him.
Correct.
So it doesn't seem like for Pilate, finding out what the truth is of paramount importance.
Yes.
He has a different priority. He has something else that he wants more than the truth, which seems to be he just wants to stay in power. He doesn't want to lose his position. He doesn't want the headache of the Jews rebelling against him. He'd rather have all of that than have the truth. And so maybe that's part of the reason why Jesus stays silent, because Jesus knows no matter what he says, Pilate doesn't even want the truth, right? We have this term, an inconvenient truth, right? That came from politics a while ago. But he is there as an inconvenient person with an inconvenient truth that Pilate doesn't want to hear.
Which is why the question that he asks is nuanced, because when it comes to the truth, you always have these alternatives to the truth that are very close to it. And if you don't employ both the discernment and the desire to actually uncover what the truth is, or to follow the truth, it's very easy to make the wrong choice. Just think of how it works. I find no basis, verse 38, for the charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews? They shouted, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. Give us Barabbas. Give us the son of the Father. So you have the king of the Jews and the son of the Father. And the names are very similar. So there's this almost, at least if you're looking at the docket, before you being tried for crucifixion today, you have Jesus, the son of the Father, who is also the king of the Jews, and you have Barabbas, the son of the Father, who attempted to become the king of the Jews. Who are you going to choose? And the people choose Barabbas. And it's so similar, yet it's not. And the decision is made, obviously, against Jesus, because I think we aren't interested in the discernment process that pursuing the truth necessitates.
It is interesting because at every alternative, everybody picks not Jesus, right? Here is the Son of God himself, the true Messiah, and everybody picks something else. We've talked a little bit about why Pilate chose to allow Jesus' crucifixion. When I was reading through this passage, I wondered why the crowd chose Barabbas, right? I kind of understand why the Jewish leaders, they were hell-bent on getting rid of Jesus. They thought he was the ultimate threat to their own power and their own existence and their position in the Jewish nation. But why the crowd? This crowd who just days before had celebrated Jesus with hosannas and the waving of palm branches, how do they turn around and they pick Barabbas instead of Jesus? Was it a different crowd? Was it what's going on here?
So there is the historical realities, which I can share, but I think the historical realities might explain why it went this way, but probably are not going to elucidate the point that John is trying to make. So the historical reality is this. The historical reality is that there is a great divide between Judea and all the other provinces that comprise the land formerly known as Israel. The other reality is that Jesus' movement remains, for the most part of his 3.5 years of ministry, a movement that is confined to kind of these backwater provinces, right? It's a movement that flourishes in Galilee and in Capernaum, and to some degree in the suburbs that are on the outskirts of Jerusalem. But Jesus doesn't really, at least in the Gospel of John, doesn't really spend that much time in Jerusalem. The visits that he has in Jerusalem are punctuated by these massive conflicts that he encounters, and by people curious about who Jesus is, but not really convinced about who Jesus is. So you have kind of these dual crowds that are emerging throughout the gospel, right? You have the crowds that are representing these people that have been marginalized, that are following him, that are seeing him, and that have front row tickets to his earthly ministry. And then you have the people in Jerusalem who really haven't had a chance to make up their minds about who Jesus is. So here we are, it's the Passover. And the amount of people that have descended upon Jerusalem is incredible. It was incredible every Passover because that was the point of being Jewish. That was the one thing that unified the Jews living in Roman-occupied Judea. So they come to Jerusalem. Now, the Jews that are kind of part of this Jesus movement are probably forced to stay on the outskirts of the city. And so you can almost see as Jesus enters the city, embraced by his own and one of his own, they are looking at this man and they're saying, finally one of our own, a Galilean, is actually coming into Jerusalem. And we're very excited about this, because that probably means that there is going to be a whole reconstruction in the social structure that is Judea. The people inside of Jerusalem, they are nervous, right? Because we've seen, at least John has hinted at these tensions that exist between the inhabitants of Jerusalem and those that reside outside of Jerusalem. So they're probably a bit nervous. And they're not sure that they're game for this whole reconstitution of the social strata in Judea. So they form this other crowd. I think within that week, there's a lot of things happening. There's probably the disappointment that there is no major social political revolution. And so those who are supporting Jesus on the basis of he's one of our own have probably, by this point, dealt with their fair share of disappointment, because the changes that they've envisioned haven't happened.
Wow.
On the other hand, you have these people living inside Jerusalem that just haven't really been bought into Jesus, period, because the system and the structure benefits them. And so you have this very practical reality that even those who follow Jesus, when Jesus doesn't fulfill their desires or their views or their ideas of what truth should be, they will abandon him.
Wow.
Secondly, you'll find, I think, the deeper theological point. So that's the historical point. The deeper theological point, Joey, is that, as you know, Jewish or not, human beings are often ruled by this idea that even if we don't have much, what we have is worth preserving. And Jesus is a attack. Jesus' movement, his ministry represent this attack to that which we have. And I don't want what I have being threatened. So I will choose the revolutionary because I've grown up in Jerusalem hearing tales of revolutionaries. I've grown up in Jerusalem seeing crosses. I've grown up in Jerusalem seeing armed revolt after armed revolt fail. I know that. That's something that I've recognized. This I don't understand. I don't recognize it. It scares me, and so I want nothing to do with it.
Yeah, this idea that I'd rather have the demon I know rather than the demon I don't. Right. Jesus is this unknown factor. I love how you set up the socio-historical perspective of what's going on here and the dynamics between the Galileans versus the Judeans and the tension that exists. And seeing it that way, you could see how Jesus would be such a threat, because he obviously, if you know nothing about him, just that he's a Galilean and that he has the support of all the Galileans, as a Judean, automatically you see him as a threat.
Right.
Like he's not one of us, right? And even though I would rather have someone who's not, I wouldn't want a revolutionary in general, but I'd rather have one that's one of us than one that I have no idea what he's going to stand for and what he's going to do. He's a wild card. And so all of these people, like Pilate, he's trying to preserve his power and his position. The crowd, they're trying to preserve their lifestyle. The Jewish leaders, they're trying to preserve their power, and they're all trying to manipulate the situation to do what will protect them. And yet, while they're doing that, they miss the point, which Jesus is making directly to the Pilate, which is, my kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not of this world. You're doing all of these things to stop me, and yet the path that I'm on is not ordained by you. It's ordained by God. And so no matter how you manipulate things, how you think you're going to preserve your position and power, ultimately what's going to happen is going to happen because of God, which is why Jesus says, Pilate's question to him in verse 10 of 19, do you refuse to speak to me? Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you? Like in Pilate's mind, Jesus's approach to this whole trial is mind-boggling because he thinks, man, I want to be on your side. I want to help you. Just give me something, right? And Jesus is staying silent. And yet Pilate is actually the one who's missed the point.
Yeah.
Because Jesus says, I don't need to say anything. Because Jesus answered, verse 11, you would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin, right? So he is saying, this path that I'm on has really nothing to do with you. It has to do with God putting me on this path, and the people, these Jewish leaders who knew what they were doing and put you in front of me, they're the ones who are guilty of the greater sin.
And that is just so heartbreakingly true. You've mentioned there's these dual desires that are competing. The desire for power, the desire for certainty. Anything, if left to its own devices, will decay and return as quickly as it can, particularly a system, to a state of stasis. That's just the nature of systems. And so any kind of change, whether it be a change to the religious order or a change to the political system or a change to the way we value one another, any change to any system that we create is going to take painful decisions that are going to hurt. And I think one of the things that, as you were talking about, was just so evident is that we don't like stuff that hurts. And sometimes the fear of the pain that change will bring keeps us in these systems that are not beneficial or ideal for anyone. I mean, Pilate didn't want to be there. That's why he didn't live in Jerusalem. He hated it. He moved to Caesarea Maritima, right? He don't want to be there. That wasn't his goal for his life. Sadly, he becomes this tragic footnote in history. But he didn't want to change, and ultimately that inability to change leads him to this life that is not the ideal. The Roman people that are listening to this, they don't want to be there, and yet they make these decisions because they want to prevent a revolt, and then a revolt happens. The Jews living there, they don't want this. They don't want to be destroyed. They don't want a revolution, and yet there is a revolution, and the religious leaders want to maintain their control and their power, and yet there is no power to be maintained because it's all gone within a couple decades. And so the inability to change and to question the system and to actually pay the price that transforming any system is going to extol keeps them in this stance of trying to maintain what they already have. And I guess they don't realize that they've lost what little they have, or they will lose what little they have.
Yeah, that's such a great point. That all these things that each of these groups are holding on so tight to, they eventually lose anyway, right? Pilate, he loses his power and position. There is a revolt that happens in AD 70, right, in Jerusalem that turns everything over, and the Romans crack down and they destroy the temple. Like, all of these things actually happen. The things that they feared the most, they don't actually stop this from happening by crucifying Jesus. All they do is they kill the Son of God. The only one who provides any kind of hope for them. And that's, you make such a great point. I mean, we both read that book by Edwin Friedman, the failure of nerve. And that's precisely what he talks about. It's really that anxiousness in the system, the anxiousness in the society over the fear of losing something that prevents us from engaging in the change that is necessary for our lives, right? And Jesus has been pushing them towards this change, and they experience the failure of nerve, and they crucify him, they destroy him, or they attempt to destroy him.
Right.
And yet, at that moment where it seems like they've succeeded and Jesus has lost, Jesus says this powerful phrase, "It is finished," right? And for the outsider looking up, you could think, oh, does that mean that he's giving up? Does that mean that he's admitting finally that he's lost? And yet it has a completely different meaning, right? Like, this battle, we've won.
Yes.
Yes. At this moment of what looks like incredible shame and loss, God is ultimately glorified, and it is finished. We've won.
And that's the ultimate transformation. You don't have the birth of a movement that obviously is different from any other religious movement. I mean, because it's a religious movement that says God died. You have the birth of this religious movement that is built on different things because somebody was willing to pay the price that the necessary change will inevitably necessitate, right? This is Jesus.
Yeah.
Jesus is the only one who courageously says,
Wow.
I will pay the price. And it's not just, I think we minimize what is going on here when we say, well, what is actually happening is there's this exchange of sin, right? The sins of the world are placed upon Jesus. And that's absolutely part of what is happening. But what is actually happening is there is a shift, a cataclysmic shift in the way we understand God because of this moment.
Yeah.
And that change, to view God in ways that are so approachable, to view a God who identifies and has solidarity with those who suffer, that shift is one that ultimately is paid in blood by God, who says it's worth it.
Yeah. And that, I love how you said this, that is what sets Christianity apart from other religions, right? That God himself is willing to make this kind of sacrifice and pay in blood, do the thing that nobody else is willing to do, everybody else is scared to do. He steps in and he sacrifices, and he's willing to do that. And then from that, Jesus dies, they bury him. It's almost like there's this like rush thing because of the Sabbath is coming and everybody's rushed. It's like his burial isn't even properly done, even though, I love this moment that Joseph of Arimathea, who has been afraid to come out and saying that he's a follower of Jesus, he comes forward, he wraps Jesus. Nicodemus, who has been hiding in the shadows, he comes out, and so you get these hints that from those actions, you get this hint that not everything is in vain. Because if you didn't know the story of Jesus, if you didn't know this and you're just reading this for the very first time, you would think, oh my goodness, this is the end, right? And then you get these hints, literally, that something is still happening. There's still people who haven't given up on Jesus. There's still a disciple who can take care of his mother, right? You get these senses, you get these hints, and then the women come. And I love how John does this. It's the resurrection is almost subtle, right? In other gospels, there's a sense of like, oh, the angelic hosts come down. There's, the soldiers are so afraid and they run away, and you get this miraculous moment. Here, they just show up and the tomb is empty, and you get a sense of what it was like for Jesus's followers, because they didn't see all of that. They didn't see the glory and the, the angels and the rolling over away of the stone. They didn't witness any of that. They witness it as there's just an empty tomb, and it's confusion. This moment of that should be like Jesus has risen, right? The exciting moment is just confusion, and that's and yet that moment of confusion, again, the great reversal, becomes a moment of great hope.
Now, I think the reason why John is kind of sparse on special effects is because you already have had that from the beginning.
Yeah.
From the beginning of his gospel. From the very beginning, this is what it's been about. Woman, my hour has not yet come. Well, the hour is here now. And it's almost, you almost see Jesus saying, okay, the hour is here. This is what we've been dress rehearsing for.
Yeah.
You will have a woman weeping. And again, as he has said so many times throughout the gospel, why are you crying? You'll have this group of men that is afraid. And Jesus will say, do not be afraid.
Yeah.
Right? Do not be afraid. Do not cry. The hour has come. And then we are reminded that our life really is lived in that liminal space that happens between Friday and Sunday. That's life here.
Yeah.
That's life here. The question is, what do you do, or how do you live in that interlude, in that Sabbath space, in that space of silence between cross and second coming?
Yeah.
What do you do? And I think Jesus is saying, well, you take cheer because the hope is coming. The hour will come.
Yeah.
You stop weeping, and you do not yield into fear.
That's well said. Because we like the disciples during this time, we are waiting for Jesus to come again, right? And we have the advantage of knowing that he will come. The disciples, Jesus had told them many times that he would come again, that he would be resurrected, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will rebuild it, right? He had given them those hints, but they weren't expecting it. They weren't expecting it at all. And so when they show up on the tomb, they are very shocked and very surprised. And I love the interaction between these two men, how John's personality and Peter's personality are shown in how they approach the tomb. Like Peter just rushes in. John is like, is this a sacred space? Should we be coming in? And Peter just goes in. But neither of them are expecting an empty tomb. The women are not expecting the empty tomb. And they're thinking of all sorts of reasons why Jesus has not been resurrected, that he's been stolen, that people have taken him away. They have all of these concepts of why is Jesus not there? And yet then they begin to hope because they see the burial clothes folded up, which I love how the lesson points out. If someone had stolen the body, why would they just leave the burial clothes there folded up? If someone steals from a tomb, they would steal it in a way, they would just take everything, right? And so that gives them a hint that something has happened here, and maybe they start to even remember some of the things that Jesus has said, and then they begin to hope. And yet, like you talked about, that's the space that we're in, right? We haven't seen Jesus again yet. We have all these hints that he's coming back. And the question for us is the same as the question that has been throughout the book of John, which is, will you believe? Will you believe?
And the answer, hopefully, is we believe because that is the truth. Ultimately, the question that I think Pilate should have asked is, who are you?
Mm.
Because that is the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to that question will represent the answer to every question. It really isn't that complicated.
Mm.
But the fear and the failure of nerve, as we've been talking about, keep us from asking the question, who is God?
Mm.
And if God is these things that we say he is, what does that mean for how I live my life?
Yeah.
Because if Jesus is the king, then that means I need to subject all these other things that cannot be the king of my life.
Mm.
If Jesus has called me into a space of life, then I need to, sadly, supplant all these practices that lead to death, that I might think are useful because they're maintaining what little life I think I have, right? If Jesus is the gardener, then I need to stop hiding in the garden. It just, who are you is ultimately the question. And Jesus will say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes to the Father except through me.
So then the question really is, so when we ask the question, will you believe? And that's the question throughout the book of John. When John asks this question, he's not just saying, will you believe in the Jesus that you want him to be? Or will you believe in the Jesus that you've made him out to be? The question is, will you believe in the Jesus who Jesus says he is?
Correct.
Right? And like you pointed out, that has great implications for how we live and how we follow that kind of Jesus.
Yeah, Joey, because that Jesus is an inconvenient truth, as you said. And so the question, well, it's not really a question, it's a decision.
Yeah.
And the decision is, do you and do I, during this holiday season, as the pages of a new year commence to close, do we have the courage to be inconvenienced?
Wow. That's a great question to end on. Do we have the willingness to be inconvenienced by Jesus?
Joey, pray for us.
Our good and gracious God, this has been an incredible journey through this gospel, the Gospel of John. And so right here near the end of this year, we're faced with a question that you constantly put before all of us, which is, will you believe? Will you believe me when I say who I say I am? Not who we say you are, who we want you to be, or who society says you are, but who you say you are. Even when it's inconvenient and it's painful and it challenges us to grow and change in ways that we don't want to. Lord, we believe. Help us our unbelief. Amen.
Well, we have nothing else to say except Joey and I will be in and out in the next couple of weeks, but we'll still be here with you. We hope that you tune in next week as we close our lesson on John, as we celebrate the last Sabbath of 2024. But until then, may you believe and may you have a Merry Christmas in the company of those you love and of the one who remains the truth. See you next week.